All right, so Civic Nebraska's position on voter ID is pretty straightforward. As I mentioned before, we are usually one of the lead opponents on this issue in front of the legislature. There was a voter ID law in this most recent session before it was interrupted by the pandemic. Um, it had its hearing in late February, and we were there. We testified. A big part of my job is to attend the committee hearings and um, express Civic Nebraska's position formally in front of the Government, Military, and Veterans Affairs Committee, which is where all the elections bills go. Um, we've taken a lot of different approaches towards voter ID in the past. We've talked about voter suppression. We've talked about money because voter ID laws are not free to implement. This time around, I reminded the committee rather, of the 5 questions that they tend to ask of other bills, but for some reason tend to ignore when it comes to voter ID. So I asked them those questions in the committee. And those 5 questions are, and we'll just kind of quickly unpack these. Number 1, is there a clear problem that you're solving? So people who want to make it harder to vote usually bring up 2 problems that they think can be fixed by voter ID. Those problems are voter fraud and fear of voter fraud. So the first issue, voter fraud, the only kind of voter fraud that can be prevented by voter ID is voter impersonation fraud. So that's when you go to the polls and pretend to be someone else. The number of voter impersonation cases in Nebraska has been exactly 0. I think there's been 1 recorded case of a voter fraud conviction since in the last decade, and it was in 2016. There were 2 new citizens who accidentally voted twice. They applied to vote by mail, and then they also voted in person. It was found out later. I think it was the judge thought it was a genuine mistake, but they still did it, so they got fined like $100, and their vote was obviously nullified. It's very important to know that double voting is not prevented by voter ID. In fact, the 2 gentlemen who were convicted of voting twice had valid photo IDs. They presented them in both cases, and the problem was not pretending to be someone else. It was that they tried to participate twice. The system worked. It was flagged. When they went to vote in person, it was already noted on the register on the voter rolls that they'd already voted. So that's what happened. The second problem that proponents try to talk about is fear of voter fraud, and it's worth asking a question here that we usually skip, which is, why are people afraid of voter fraud? Our position is that people are afraid of voter fraud because politicians have made them afraid of voter fraud. The second really important question to ask is a question of solvency. So is there evidence that your policy will be effective? We don't question, we being Civic Nebraska, we don't question for a second that a lot of people are feeling unsure about election processes, and public trust in elections is value number 1 for us when it comes to supporting legislation. That's why it's really important to remember that there is exactly 0 evidence proving that voter ID laws even make people feel better when it comes to the state of elections or the existence of voter fraud. One of the largest studies about voter fraud ever conducted it's technically still a working paper from 2019. They had something like 1 billion voter behavior samples, and in it they discovered that states with voter ID laws have seen no noticeable change either in the commission of fraud or people's perception that voter fraud is being committed. So they don't even do anything to make people feel better. The third question that senators are constantly asking each other is, are you spending money? The answer here is yes, that implementing voter ID laws cost money, and a lot of it. Now, people can try to get sneaky with this because in the legislative process, when you introduce a bill, there is an administrative office in the legislature called the Legislative Research Office, and they put out what's called a fiscal fiscal note, and that's basically an educated guess on what your bill is going to cost if it's implemented. Now, constitutional amendments don't get to have fiscal notes because they don't actually make any changes. They just require the legislature to pass a future bill, and that bill would have a fiscal note. So if you were to look up 2020's voter ID bill, it technically has a fiscal note of 0, but that's because it was a constitutional amendment, so don't be tricked by that. The most recent fiscal note we had for an actual voter ID bill is from 2018, and it had an initial cost of $2.9 million with a budgeted recurring cost of about $750,000 a year. That's because in order to not violate Article 1, Section 22 of the Nebraska Constitution, the state would have to provide free IDs to everyone who doesn't currently have one, and that is very expensive. The fourth question is this money the most effective use of taxpayer dollars right now? And the answer is just pretty simply no. Senators are being asked to spend money on an issue that lacks any evidence, it lacks any proof that it's effective, and that's just a bad use of taxpayer dollars. And then the last question I asked, and this is a little more technical and specific, is your bill written in the most effective and responsible form? This is a criticism of this particular approach to voter ID bills, which is about passing a constitutional amendment that just says we have to pass a voter ID bill. That requires senators and the public to sign on to a petition or to a proposal that doesn't have any specifics. It allows no wiggle room for negotiating. There's no guarantees of what the law will or won't include. There's no guarantees about the money that's required. There's no guarantees about which IDs will or won't be valid. This is particularly important, especially for Native Americans in Nebraska. Across the country, some states' ID laws include tribal IDs, some of them don't. But regardless, if you pass a constitutional amendment, the legislators then have no choice but to pass a bill that resolves the mandate of that constitutional amendment. And I think it's a lousy position to put our legislators in, but especially when it comes to an issue as sensitive as this. So the bottom line is that voter ID laws just don't add up for us because there's no problem that you're proving to solve, and you're spending a lot of money purportedly just to make people feel better, but there's not even any proof that it will help us feel better, much less do anything to actually make our elections safer. So that's our position on voter ID. Rather than cut off the video, we'll go ahead and transition into the next issue here really quick. The second major issue that we work on a lot is felon voting rights in Nebraska. This is another issue that varies wildly by state. Every state has a different law on the voting rights for people who are either currently serving or have previously served a felony sentence in Nebraska. There are two states, Vermont and Maine, that allow everyone to vote even from prison. I think the one exception is if you've committed treason, which is pretty much nobody. There's a lot of states that allow you to vote as soon as you are released from prison. Then there's another group of states that allow you to vote once you're released from prison and are off probation/parole. And then there's a really crummy group that Nebraska is a part of. There's like 5 states left that have some kind of restriction beyond your sentence and probation and parole. So in Nebraska, we are, of course, uniquely strange in this area of the law. So the rule in Nebraska is that if you're convicted of a felony, your right to vote goes away immediately. Once you've served, let's say you serve a 10-year sentence, once you've served your sentence and have done any sort of supervised release, you're off probation, you're off parole, we call that being completely off paper, and that can take, another 2 years, it could take another 7 years, it depends on your particular situation. Once all of that is done, sentence, probation, parole, you still can't vote until another 2 years have gone by, unclear why, and then once that has happened, you're eligible to re-register. Not a great situation. Until 2005, Nebraskans who were convicted of a felony couldn't vote at all. In 2005, that law changed to get the 2-year waiting period. The author of that bill will fully admit that the 2-year waiting period was just what turned out to be an unnecessary negotiating tactic, which really stinks. It serves no actual policy purpose. This is one of those issues that cannot be separated from people's preconceptions of what it means to be a convicted felon. I think that a lot of people and sometimes politicians will prey on this misconception. When people think of felons, they think of convicted murderers, they think of armed bank robbers, they think of people who have committed massive fraud schemes. And those people are felons, but there are the vast majority of people who've been convicted of a felony have committed nonviolent crimes, and they're people who don't behave or look like politicians try to portray. I have a number of convicted felons in my family. None of them are violent. All of them are very good citizens now. I've got 2 relatives who did some pretty stupid stuff when they were in college. They got arrested, they got sent to prison, and now they're fine. But depending on the state they live, they could either never vote again, or they have to be pardoned by the governor, or if they're in Nebraska, they couldn't vote until all of their sentence plus 2 years. Again, there's no evidence whatsoever that this policy works, that it does anything. A key term to be aware of here for this particular voting rights issue, and for obviously any sort of incarceration issue, is recidivism. So that's the measure of if someone recidivates, that means they went to prison, they got out, and they went back to prison for something. The recidivism rate is something that's talked about all the time in this discussion, and it's a question of, can we prove that having your voting rights will result in reduced recidivism rates? I'm going to upload a couple of materials here that we use in this conversation. Recidivism, the connection between recidivism and voting rights. Causation, which is what we're often asked to do, is impossible to prove, right? Because the only way to prove causation between voting rights and lower recidivism rates would be to enact a new policy today and then measure what happened, which I'm all for. So the best thing that we can do is look at other states who have before and after samples. Florida, who incarcerates an obscene amount of people per capita, they did a study actually in 2011 that I happened to find in the depths of the internet, where they did actually measure the recidivism rates of felons statewide and also just released felons who had their voting rights restored by the Board of Parole. They measured what's called the 3-year recidivism rate. So that would mean, like, if you were released in 2009, the 3-year recidivism rate is who from that 2009, we'll call it like some kind of sick class, that class 2009, how many of them went back to prison before the end of 2012. That's the 3-year recidivism rate. The 3-year rate statewide during their study was about 26%, which is similar to what it is every year. 26% statewide. The recidivism rate in that same period for released felons who had their voting rights restored was 4.5%, or less than a fifth of the recidivism rate for everyone else. That is significant. It's very meaningful. If you're talking to someone who will only be swayed by hard data, that's about as good as we can get. So that's a discussion we have a lot, and I've attached a lot of those materials. But the other thing to think about, the big question that looms here for voting rights for former felons is, why is the restriction of voting rights necessary in the first place? This is one of the reasons why we had us do our exercise at the beginning of deciding who can vote and what are the rules. Our biggest obstacle to changing rules about felon voting rights is that that's just how it's been, and people are used to it. I have yet to ever hear someone give me a reason that is enforced with evidence. No one has been able to explain to me why this policy has a meaningful, positive impact. Our position, and the position, frankly, of almost every policymaker in the state on other issues, but somehow not on this one, our position is that if you're going to restrict someone's constitutional right, you better have a really, really good reason to do that. And that reason needs to include proof that this voting rights restriction, or that right restriction, is going to have a meaningful impact. This is the same argument that Second Amendment advocates make for restricting gun rights. If you're going to take away my right, you better have a damn good reason why you're doing so, and you better be able to prove it. It's the same argument we use for free speech. If you're going to restrict my freedom of speech, you better prove crystal clear that it was necessary and that it was actually effective, that you restricted my right in this way. That's a very reasonable burden that we talk about with the First and Second Amendment, but we somehow forget when it comes to the 14th, the 19th, the 26th. So those are the kind of questions that we ask. I want to show you a quick video that we produced on this issue, I guess 2 years ago now. We interviewed one of our friends named Katrina. Katrina is a phenomenal voting rights advocate. She most recently worked for the Reentry Alliance, which focuses on helping smooth transitions for Nebraskans who are coming out of the incarceral system. And so she's lived this experience of being convicted, not being able to vote, and then having her voting rights restored. And that experience is what caused her to realize just how big of a deal this is. So I want to show you Katrina's video. On any of these issues, if you have thoughts, I know it's kind of hard to cover the entirety of an issue over a video. So you guys will all have my email address after this. So if you have questions, if you have thoughts, if you have concerns, drop me a line. Happy to talk about it. This is what I do all the time. Because I know that these issues can get pretty complex, and I hope that you guys will have some questions after this. So for now, that's enough of me talking. Check out the materials that I posted on some of the more policy work we do on felon voting rights, but I think even more importantly, please now check out Katrina's video.